June the 28th, 1914. A street corner in the city of Sarajevo. A young man steps forward, raises a pistol, and fires. Within moments, the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife are dead. And this, you were told, is how the First World War began. One bullet, one assassination. A spark that somehow set the whole world on fire. It is one of the most famous stories in history, and it is deeply misleading. Because a single murder, however shocking, does not drag entire continents into 4 years of industrial slaughter that would claim millions of lives. Assassinations happened. Kings and archdukes had been killed before, without the world collapsing. So the real question is not who fired the shot. The real question is this: why was the entire world already a loaded gun, waiting for someone to pull the trigger? Because the true origin of the First World War does not begin in Sarajevo in 1914. It begins decades earlier, in the boardrooms of banks, in the shipyards of arms manufacturers, and on the construction site of a railway that threatened to redraw the balance of global power. This is the hidden economic history of how the world went to war. And it starts with a country that grew too powerful, too fast. That country was Germany. For most of the 19th century, Germany did not even exist as a single nation. It was a patchwork of separate states. Then, in 1871, it was unified into one country, the German Empire. And what happened next stunned the world. Germany industrialized at breathtaking speed. In just a few decades, it transformed from an agricultural collection of states into an industrial powerhouse. German steel production soared. German chemical and electrical industries became the most advanced on Earth. German companies, names like Krupp in steel and weapons, and Deutsche Bank in finance, grew into giants. And by the early 20th century, Germany had done something that alarmed the established order. Its industrial output had begun to rival, and in key areas surpass, that of Great Britain. For Britain, this was an existential shock. Britain had been the workshop of the world, the first industrial nation, the dominant economic power for over a century. And now a young, aggressive, united Germany was overtaking it. This was not just wounded pride. It was a fundamental threat to Britain's entire position in the world. Two great industrial economies, now direct rivals, competing for the same markets, the same customers, the same global dominance. The economic competition was real, and it was fierce. But economic rivalry alone does not have to mean war. Nations compete without fighting all the time. So what turned this competition into something deadly? The answer lies in a series of specific pressure points where money, power, and strategy collided. And the first was a railway. Germany, this rising industrial giant, needed markets and resources, and it looked toward the Middle East. The Great German Project was the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, an ambitious plan to build a rail line connecting Germany through its ally, the Ottoman Empire, all the way to the Persian Gulf. On the surface, it was a commercial venture. But look at what it actually threatened. That region was becoming critical for one reason above all. Oil. The world's navies were beginning to convert from coal to oil, and the Middle East held vast reserves of it. A German-controlled railway running to the Persian Gulf would give Germany direct access to that oil and to the markets of the region. Worse, from Britain's point of view, it threatened Britain's vital routes to its most important colony, India, and its lifeline through the Suez Canal. This railway was not just steel and track. It was a potential shift in the entire global balance of power, a German highway cutting straight through a region Britain considered essential to its empire. It triggered something close to strategic panic in London. It alarmed Russia, which had its own ambitions in the region. The railway became a source of deep international tension, a physical symbol of Germany's growing reach and of the threat it posed to the existing order. And then came the second and most dangerous pressure point, the naval arms race. Britain's power had always rested on one thing above all: its navy. The Royal Navy ruled the seas, protected its empire, and guarded the trade that made Britain rich. For Britain, naval supremacy was not negotiable. It was survival. And Germany decided to challenge it. Under Kaiser Wilhelm II and his naval chief, Germany began building a massive battle fleet designed to rival the Royal Navy. And Britain responded exactly as you would expect. It began building too, faster and bigger. This set off one of the most dangerous arms races in history, and it centered on a single revolutionary warship. In 1906, Britain launched a battleship so advanced it made every other warship on Earth obsolete overnight. It was called the Dreadnought. It was faster, better armored, and more heavily armed than anything before it. And here is the strange twist. By launching it, Britain reset the race to zero. Suddenly, all of Britain's older battleships counted for little. The only ships that mattered now were dreadnoughts, and Germany could start building those from scratch on almost equal footing. So both nations poured enormous resources into building fleets of these steel monsters. The public in both countries was whipped into a frenzy, demanding more ships. And every new German battleship made Britain more afraid, and every new British battleship made Germany more determined. It was a countdown, and both sides were building the clock. And now we arrive at the players who profited from all of it. The arms manufacturers, building dreadnoughts, artillery, rifles, and shells, was staggeringly profitable, and a handful of enormous private companies dominated this trade. Krupp in Germany, Vickers and Armstrong in Britain, Schneider in France. These arms firms were among the largest and most powerful corporations in the world. And here is the deeply uncomfortable part. These companies often sold weapons to everyone. To their own governments, yes, but frequently to rival nations as well, and to smaller countries arming themselves across Europe and beyond. War and the preparation for war was their entire business. Rising international tension was, quite simply, good for profits. Now, it would be too simple, and historically wrong, to claim these arms makers secretly plotted the war into existence, like villains in a story. Most serious historians reject that crude conspiracy. But you do not need a conspiracy for the incentive to matter. These powerful companies had every financial reason to encourage military spending, to lobby for bigger armies and navies, and to benefit from the climate of fear. They were a permanent interest group, woven into the governments and the economies of the great powers, and their interest pointed always in one direction. More weapons, more spending, more fear, and the money that funded all this militarization flowed through the banks. Finance tied the whole system together. French banks, for instance, poured enormous sums, billions of francs, into Russia, funding the modernization of the Russian army and the building of Russian railways, designed to move troops quickly to the German border. France was, in effect, financing a military ally to threaten Germany from the east. And this was not just charity between allies. It altered the entire strategic calculation because it made Russia a faster, more dangerous military machine, which in turn shaped how Germany thought about the timing of any future war. Money and alliances became the same thing. Capital flowed across borders, binding nations into military partnerships, funding the armies that would eventually march. And underneath all of it lay the deepest structural pressure of all: imperialism, the scramble for colonies. In these decades, the great powers of Europe raced to seize territory across Africa and Asia, carving up entire continents for resources, markets, and prestige. This competition wired the powers together into a tense, interlocking system. It created friction points all over the globe, in Morocco, in the Balkans, in Asia, where the interests of the empires collided. And it locked them into a network of alliances, secret treaties, and mutual obligations designed to protect their positions. And that alliance system is what turned a local crisis into a global catastrophe, because Europe had divided itself into two armed camps. On one side, Germany and Austria-Hungary. On the other, France, Russia, and eventually Britain, bound together by agreements that said, if you are attacked, I will fight. So by 1914, this was the true state of the world. Two industrial superpowers locked in economic rivalry. A naval arms race counting down. Arms manufacturers profiting from every rise in tension. Banks financing the militarization of entire nations. Empires competing across the globe. And a rigid system of alliances that meant any conflict between two powers would automatically drag in all the others. The entire structure was a loaded gun. The powder was packed. The hammer was cocked. All it needed was a finger on the trigger. And in Sarajevo in June 1914, it got one. When Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia and moved to punish it. Russia, bound by alliance and ambition, mobilized to protect Serbia. Germany, bound to Austria-Hungary, mobilized against Russia. France, bound to Russia, mobilized against Germany. And when Germany's war plan sent its armies through Belgium to strike at France, Britain entered the war too. In a matter of weeks, One assassination had activated the entire alliance system, and the loaded gun went off. The world went to war. Now, this brings us to the greatest historical debate of the 20th century, the argument over who was truly responsible. And it is worth laying out honestly, because serious historians disagree. For decades after the war, there was fierce dispute. Then, in 1961, a German historian named Fritz Fischer dropped a bombshell. Fischer argued, using German documents, that Germany had not simply stumbled into war, but had deliberately pushed for it, as a bid to become a dominant world power, and bore the primary responsibility. His thesis caused an uproar, especially in Germany, and it shaped debate for a generation. But more recently, other historians have pushed back. The historian Christopher Clark, in his influential 2012 book, The Sleepwalkers, argued that Europe's leaders were more like sleepwalkers, men who stumbled toward the abyss through miscalculation, fear, and misunderstanding, none of them fully intending the catastrophe that resulted. In this view, there was no single guilty mastermind, only a collection of anxious leaders trapped in a system that pushed them toward war. And this is where the economic story offers something both debates can miss. Because whether Germany's leaders actively wanted war, or Europe's leaders sleepwalked into it, the deeper question is why the situation was so explosive in the first place. Why was the gun loaded at all? And the answer lies in the structure. In the economic rivalry, the arms race, the financial entanglements, the profits of the weapons makers, and the imperial competition that had turned Europe into a machine primed for catastrophe. The individuals mattered. Their choices in July 1914 mattered enormously, but they were making those choices inside a system that had been built over decades to make war more likely, more profitable, and harder to stop. This is not a claim that shadowy financiers plotted the whole thing in secret. It is something more sobering. It is the argument that a global system of imperial and economic competition had created conditions where war became, for too many powerful interests, either acceptable or even desirable, and where the machinery of alliances made it nearly impossible to contain once it began. The assassination did not cause the First World War. It triggered it. The cause was the loaded gun that decades of economic rivalry, militarism, and imperial greed had so carefully constructed. And that is the part the simple story leaves out. It is far easier to blame one young man with a pistol than to examine the banks, the arms firms, the shipyards, and the imperial ambitions that had made the great powers of Europe into a system that was primed to explode. The bullet in Sarajevo is remembered. The boardrooms and the shipyards and the balance sheets are forgotten. But it was the system that made the war, not the spark, which leaves a genuinely difficult question, and I want to know where you land on it. Do you think the First World War was structurally inevitable, given the economic system that had turned Europe into a powder keg, or could different choices by a few individuals in 1914 have prevented it? Tell me in the comments what you think, because historians have argued over this for 100 years, and I do not believe there is a simple answer. And if this pulled apart a story you thought you understood, if you want more history where the real cause is hidden beneath the one everyone repeats, then subscribe and stay with us. Because the next story we are opening up is another moment where the world was told one thing, while the truth sat buried in the ledgers the entire time. You will not want to miss it.